A lonely widow rescued a kitten, not knowing it would lead her to true love. Margaret Winters stared at the phrase etched on her refrigerator calendar, day 365, marking a full year since Robert's passing. She traced the number with her fingertip, the cool metal surface a stark contrast to the warmth that once filled her home. 1 year. 365 mornings of waking to emptiness, of reaching across cold sheets, of making coffee for one. Outside her kitchen window, autumn painted the world in shades of amber and rust, but Margaret barely noticed. At 63, she moved through her days like a ghost haunting her own life, present but not quite living. The Victorian home that had once echoed with laughter now creaked with silence. Each room held memories that both comforted and tormented her. Robert's reading chair, still indented with the shape of him, his gardening gloves, stiff from disuse but impossible to discard, the collection of bird-watching journals they'd kept together for 38 years. "This is ridiculous," she muttered, wrapping her cardigan tighter around her thin frame. The doctor had warned her about talking to herself, suggesting it might be a sign she needed more social interaction. But who would she talk to? Their friends had drifted away, uncomfortable with her grief. Their daughter lived overseas, calling dutifully every Sunday but unable to bridge the distance with her well-meaning platitudes. Margaret's routine never varied. Breakfast at 7, a slow walk through the neighborhood at 8, afternoons spent with crossword puzzles or half-hearted attempts at reading, dinner alone at the kitchen counter, unwilling to sit at the dining table meant for two. Today, however, the universe had different plans. As Margaret turned the corner onto Maple Street during her morning walk, an unfamiliar sound cut through the crisp October air. A high-pitched, desperate mewling coming from beneath the hedgerow that lined Mrs. Abernathy's property. She might have missed it entirely if the wind hadn't shifted just so, carrying the sound directly to her ears. Margaret paused, tilting her head. There it was again, faint but unmistakable, the distress call of something small and afraid. "Hello?" she called softly, feeling foolish for speaking to the bushes. The mewling intensified as if in response. Margaret hesitated. This wasn't part of her routine. Her walks were meant to be straightforward, predictable, a doctor-prescribed attempt at maintaining her health, nothing more. But something in that plaintive cry pulled at a part of her heart she thought had died with Robert. Sighing, she lowered herself carefully to her knees, grimacing at the protest in her joints. The damp earth immediately soaked through her slacks, but she pushed aside her discomfort and parted the dense foliage. Two tiny eyes, blue as summer twilight, stared back at her from the shadows. "Oh," Margaret breathed, her hand instinctively reaching toward the creature. A kitten, no bigger than her palm, huddled against the base of the hedge. Its gray tabby fur was matted and filthy, one ear torn and crusted with blood. The little thing trembled violently, whether from fear or cold, Margaret couldn't tell. "Where's your mama, little one?" she whispered, scanning the area for signs of other cats. Nothing. When she extended her hand closer, the kitten hissed weakly, a pitiful sound that carried more fear than threat. Margaret recognized something in that hiss, in those wary eyes, the instinct to protect oneself when the world had proven unsafe, the desperate loneliness of having no one to turn to. "I know," she murmured. "I know exactly how you feel." With gentle movements that belied her usual stiffness, Margaret shrugged off her cardigan. The morning air bit at her arms, but she hardly noticed as she carefully wrapped the bundle of wool around the trembling kitten. It struggled briefly, then went still, perhaps too exhausted to fight. "You're safe now," she told it, cradling the small bundle against her chest. The kitten's heart raced against her fingers, a tiny, frantic drumbeat. "I've got you." Only when she stood did Margaret realize she had no idea what to do next. She hadn't cared for a pet since their old retriever had died 5 years ago. She knew nothing about kittens, their needs, their care. Robert had always been the animal person between them. But Robert wasn't here. Just her. Just Margaret. "Well," she said decisively, "I suppose we're going to figure this out together." The nearest veterinary clinic was 15 blocks away. Margaret's knees protested the distance, but the weight of responsibility in her arms propelled her forward with a purpose she hadn't felt in months. By the time she pushed open the door to Lakeside Veterinary Hospital, she was winded and slightly dizzy, but determined. "I need help," she announced to the receptionist, a young woman with purple-streaked hair and kind eyes. "I found this kitten. It's hurt." The waiting room was mercifully empty that early on a Tuesday. The receptionist, whose name tag read Zoe, immediately sprang into action, peering into the cardigan bundle with professional concern. "Poor little mite," she said, gently taking the bundle from Margaret's arms. "Let me get Doctor Reed right away." Left alone in the waiting room, Margaret suddenly felt self-conscious. Her hair was windblown, her slacks mud-stained. She hadn't bothered with makeup in months. What was she doing here, inserting herself into this situation? She could have called animal control. She could have left the kitten for someone younger, more capable. Before she could follow this thought to its uncomfortable conclusion, a door opened and a man's voice called out, "Ma'am, I understand you found our little patient?" Margaret turned and found herself looking into the warmest brown eyes she'd ever seen. Doctor Reed wasn't what she expected. In her mind, veterinarians were either aging men with gruff demeanors or impossibly young women. This man was neither. He appeared to be in his late 50s, with salt and pepper hair that curled slightly at his collar and laugh lines that framed his eyes. Tall and broad-shouldered, he moved with the easy confidence of someone comfortable in his skin. The kitten looked even tinier cradled in his large hands. "Yes," she said, her voice sounding strange to her own ears. "Under a hedge on Maple Street. There was no mother cat that I could see?" "Doctor?" Reed nodded, his focus on the trembling bundle. "You did the right thing bringing her in. She's severely dehydrated and malnourished. That ear needs attention too." "Her?" Margaret asked. "Yes, a little girl," he confirmed with a gentle smile. "Would you like to come back while I examine her? Sometimes rescuers find it comforting to see the process." Margaret hesitated. The smart thing would be to leave now, to step away before she became invested, but those blue kitten eyes peered out at her from the cardigan, and she found herself nodding. "I'm James Reed, by the way," the veterinarian said as he led her through to a small examination room. "Most people just call me Jim." "Margaret Winters," she replied automatically. When was the last time she'd introduced herself to someone new? She couldn't remember. The examination room was brightly lit and immaculately clean. Jim worked with practiced efficiency, speaking softly to both Margaret and the kitten as he checked vital signs and cleaned wounds. Margaret found herself drawn into the calm circle of his attention, answering questions about exactly where and how she'd found the kitten. "She's about 7 weeks old," he explained, gently applying antiseptic to the torn ear. "Old enough to be weaned, but still very vulnerable. It's lucky you found her when you did." "Another day or two?" He didn't finish the sentence. Margaret's throat tightened. "Will she be all right?" Jim looked up, his eyes meeting hers directly for the first time. Something flickered in his expression, recognition perhaps, or simple kindness. "With proper care, yes. She needs antibiotics for infection, regular feeding to gain weight, and a safe place to recover." He paused. "Do you have other cats at home, Mrs. Winters?" "No, no pets at all. And it's just Ms. now." The words came out more sharply than she intended. His expression softened with understanding. "I'm sorry for your loss." 3 simple words, spoken without the awkward pity she'd grown to dread, just acknowledgement. Margaret's eyes burned suddenly, and she looked away, focusing on the kitten. "What happens to her now?" she asked, smoothing her trembling hands over her mud-stained slacks. "Well, normally we'd contact animal services," Jim said, administering a tiny injection with practiced ease. "But this time of year the shelters are overflowing. A kitten this small with medical needs." He let the implication hang in the air. Margaret knew what he wasn't saying. Shelters euthanized animals they couldn't care for. It was a practical reality. The thought of this tiny fighter being put down after surviving abandonment and injury made something fierce and protective surge within her. "I'll take her," Margaret said, surprising herself. Jim raised an eyebrow. "It's a big commitment. Several weeks of care at minimum." "I have time," Margaret replied dryly. Too much of it, in fact. A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "I believe you do, Ms. Winters. Let's get you set up with everything you'll need." The next hour passed in a blur of instructions, supplies, and paperwork. Jim personally demonstrated how to mix the special formula for underweight kittens, how to administer the tiny antibiotic pills, how to check the healing progress of the ear. His hands, steady and gentle, occasionally brushed against Margaret's as he showed her the proper techniques. Each brief contact sent a strange, almost forgotten sensation skittering across her skin. When it was time to leave, Margaret found herself strangely reluctant. "What should I call her?" she asked, watching as Jim carefully placed the drowsy kitten into a small carrier. He considered the question seriously. Well, you found her at a turning point in her life. A second chance. What's meaningful to you? Margaret thought of the calendar on her refrigerator, day 365, an ending and perhaps a beginning. Eve, she said finally. I'll call her Eve. Jim's smile reached his eyes. Perfect. He handed her his business card. Call me directly if you have any concerns. And I'd like to see Eve again in 3 days to check her progress. Margaret nodded, tucking the card carefully into her pocket. As she gathered the carrier and bag of supplies, she realized she felt something she hadn't experienced in exactly 365 days. Purpose. The walk home was different. Margaret noticed things she'd been blind to for months. The brilliant red of maple leaves against a cloudless blue sky, the cheerful greeting of a neighbor she'd been avoiding, the comforting weight of the carrier in her hand. Inside, Eve slept peacefully, unaware she had just changed someone's life. By evening, Margaret had transformed her sunroom into an impromptu kitten nursery. The space, once Robert's haven for reading the Sunday papers, had stood unused since his passing. Now it held a small litter box, feeding station, and cozy bed made from an old sweater box lined with soft blankets. Eve explored her new surroundings with cautious curiosity, her movements growing stronger by the hour as the medication and proper nutrition took effect. Margaret found herself constantly checking on the kitten, marveling at her resilience. How could something so tiny be so determined to survive? That night, for the first time in a year, Margaret didn't need her prescription sleep aid. She drifted off to the gentle sound of Eve's purring from the basket she'd placed beside her bed, just for tonight, just until the kitten was stronger. "Look at us," she whispered into the darkness. 2 survivors. The next 3 days established a new routine. Margaret's life now revolved around feeding schedules, medication times, and the simple joy of watching Eve grow stronger. The kitten's personality emerged bit by bit, curious, affectionate, with an endearing habit of tilting her head when Margaret spoke to her. For her follow-up appointment, Margaret took extra care with her appearance. She applied mascara and lipstick, pulled on a blue sweater that Robert had always said matched her eyes, and even spritzed a touch of perfume at her wrists. She told herself it was simply about looking presentable in public again, nothing to do with Dr. James Reed and his kind eyes. The clinic was busier this time, the waiting room half full with patients and their humans. Eve had graduated from the cardigan bundle to a proper carrier, though she meowed protestingly from inside it. Margaret found herself nervously checking her watch as the minutes ticked by. Ms. Winters? She looked up to find Jim standing in the doorway, a smile spreading across his face as he spotted her. Something in her chest fluttered. "Dr. Reed?" she replied formally, conscious of the other clients watching. "Let's see how our little fighter is doing, shall we?" He led her to the same examination room as before. Once the door closed behind them, the professional distance softened. "You look well, Margaret," he said, the familiar use of her name both startling and pleasant. "Thank you." She busied herself opening the carrier. "Eve's been eating better, and the ear seems to be healing nicely." Jim examined the kitten thoroughly, nodding with satisfaction. "You've done remarkably well with her. I'd say she's gained at least 20% of her body weight." "We've been keeping each other company," Margaret admitted. As Jim worked, he told her about his day, a dog who'd eaten an entire sock, a parrot that spoke perfect French but refused to speak English. His stories made her laugh, a rusty sound she barely recognized as her own. She found herself sharing small details in return. How Eve had discovered a sunbeam in the kitchen and spent an entire afternoon basking in it. How the kitten had a peculiar fascination with Margaret's knitting yarn. "You know," Jim said as he updated Eve's chart, "we have a small issue." Margaret's heart sank. "Is something wrong with her?" "Not at all. She's thriving." He looked up, a mischievous glint in his eyes. "The problem is, I scheduled you for a follow-up in another week, but I find I'd prefer not to wait that long to see you again." Margaret stared at him, heat rising unexpectedly to her cheeks. "I don't understand." Jim set down his pen and turned to face her fully. "Margaret, would you consider having dinner with me? Perhaps this Friday?" The question hung in the air between them. Margaret felt as if she'd walked into a dream, one of those disorienting ones where nothing makes sense. "You're asking me on a date?" "I am," he confirmed, looking slightly nervous for the first time since she'd met him. "But if I'm overstepping..." "Why?" The question escaped before she could stop it. Jim's expression softened. "Because when you walked into my clinic holding that kitten, I saw something rare, a person with a generous heart, despite her own pain. Because you make me laugh. Because I'm 61 years old and too experienced to waste time when I meet someone who intrigues me." Margaret's mind raced. It had been decades since anyone had asked her out. She wasn't prepared for this, wasn't ready. Robert had been gone only a year. What would people think? What would her daughter say? But beneath these anxieties, a small, persistent voice whispered, "What would it be like to sit across a table from this man, to learn his story, to be seen as a woman rather than a widow?" "I haven't dated since Jimmy Carter was president," she said finally, a tremor in her voice. Jim laughed, the sound warm and genuine. "Then we have something in common. My last first date was during the Reagan administration." The tension broke. Margaret found herself smiling. "Friday, then. But nothing fancy." "I'm not ready for fancy. How about Palmer's Cafe on Oak Street? 6 o'clock? His eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled. "Simple food, casual atmosphere. No pressure." "I know Palmer's." She nodded. The cozy cafe was walking distance from her home. An easy escape if things went poorly, she thought pragmatically. As she left the clinic with Eve securely in her carrier, Margaret felt disoriented, as if the world had tilted slightly on its axis. Had she really just agreed to a date? The gold band on her left hand caught the sunlight, a familiar weight she'd never considered removing, until now. At home, she placed the carrier on the kitchen floor and opened the door. Eve emerged, stretching languidly before trotting to her food dish with newfound confidence. Margaret sank into a chair, overwhelmed. "What am I doing, Eve?" she whispered. The kitten looked up briefly, blinked once, then returned to her meal with single-minded focus. Margaret's gaze drifted to the refrigerator, to the calendar that now said Day 368. She'd been so fixated on marking time since Robert's death that she hadn't considered the possibility of counting toward something new. The house seemed to hold its breath around her, the familiar silence suddenly oppressive. Would it be a betrayal to want more than this? To seek companionship, conversation, perhaps even joy? Her hand moved to the phone before she could reconsider. She dialed a number she knew by heart. "Mom?" Her daughter's voice, clear despite the distance between Boston and London, filled the kitchen. "Is everything okay? You never call midweek." "Everything's fine, Claire," Margaret assured her. She glanced at Eve, who had finished eating and was now washing her face with delicate precision. "I've adopted a kitten." "A kitten?" Claire sounded shocked. "But you always said no more pets after Rusty died." "Things change," Margaret said simply. "She was abandoned. She needed me." There was a brief silence. That's wonderful, Mom. I'm glad you have some company." Margaret took a deep breath. "There's something else. I've been asked to dinner." "By a man." The words hung awkwardly in the air. The silence stretched longer this time. "Wow," Claire finally said. "That's unexpected." "For me too," Margaret admitted. "He's a veterinarian. I met him when I took the kitten in." "And you're considering going?" Claire's tone was carefully neutral. "I've already said yes." Margaret twisted her wedding ring unconsciously. "How do you feel about it?" The question was gentle, genuine. Margaret considered it seriously. "Terrified," she answered honestly, "but also curious." "Is that terrible?" "Mom," Claire's voice softened, "Dad would want you to be happy. You know that, right? He wouldn't expect you to spend the rest of your life alone." Tears pricked at Margaret's eyes. "It feels disloyal somehow. Loving someone new doesn't erase what you had with Dad," Claire said. "It just means your heart is big enough to hold more than one love story." Margaret's throat tightened. When had her daughter become so wise? "Besides," Claire continued, "it's just dinner. You're not marrying the guy." This startled a laugh from Margaret. "No, I'm certainly not. Wear the blue dress," Claire advised. "The one with the wrap front. It makes your eyes pop." After hanging up, Margaret sat for a long time, watching Eve play with a crumpled receipt that had fallen to the floor. The kitten attacked it fiercely, then leaped away in mock terror, then crept back to pounce again. Each cycle was performed with complete commitment, as if it were the most important game in the world. Perhaps there was wisdom in that approach to life, Margaret thought. Wholehearted engagement with the present moment, without anxiety about what came before or after. Friday arrived with crisp autumn sunshine, and Margaret's nerves stretched to breaking point. She'd changed outfits 3 times before settling on Claire's suggestion of the blue wrap dress, paired with a simple cardigan and comfortable low heels. Her hair, normally pulled back in a practical ponytail, she wore loose around her shoulders. Standing before the mirror in her bedroom, she barely recognized herself. The woman who looked back at her seemed both familiar and strange, the face she knew, but animated with an emotion she hadn't seen there in a long time. Anticipation. Don't be ridiculous, she told her reflection. It's dinner. Nothing more. But as she reached for her purse, her hand hesitated over her wedding ring. She'd worn it faithfully for 40 years, through joy and hardship, through Robert's long illness and after his passing. It was a part of her, an extension of her very self. Today, for the first time, it felt like a weight. With trembling fingers, she twisted the gold band, working it past her knuckle. The pale indentation it left behind looked vulnerable, exposed. Margaret placed the ring carefully in her jewelry box, alongside Robert's wedding band, which she'd kept after the funeral. "I'm not forgetting you," she whispered, touching the rings gently. "I'm just moving forward." Palmer's Cafe was a local institution, a cozy establishment known for home-style cooking and a relaxed atmosphere. Margaret arrived 5 minutes early, her heart pounding as if she'd run all the way there. Through the window, she could see Jim already seated at a corner table reading a newspaper. He wore a blue button-down shirt that complemented his silver hair. No tie, no pretense, just a man waiting for dinner. For a wild moment, Margaret considered turning around and hurrying home. This was madness. She was too old, too set in her ways, too damaged by grief to embark on whatever this was. Then Jim looked up and saw her through the window, his face transformed with a smile that reached all the way to his eyes. He raised a hand in greeting, and Margaret found her feet carrying her through the door before she could reconsider. "You came," he said as she approached the table, standing to greet her. "I said I would," she replied, sliding into the chair he held for her. "Beautiful women have been known to change their minds." His tone was light, teasing. Margaret felt heat rise to her cheeks. When was the last time someone had called her beautiful? "Flattery will get you nowhere, doctor. Read." "Jim," he corrected gently. "And it's not flattery if it's true." The awkwardness Margaret had feared never materialized. Conversation flowed easily between them, starting with Eve's progress and expanding outward to their lives, interests, histories. Jim had been a veterinarian for 30 years, specializing in small animals after beginning his career working with livestock. "I grew up on a dairy farm in Wisconsin," he explained, his eyes crinkling with memory. "Spent my childhood elbow-deep in animal care before I even knew it was a profession. Robert and I took Claire to a dairy farm once when she was small," Margaret found herself saying. She was terrified of the cows. Wouldn't go near them. It was the first time she'd mentioned Robert's name aloud. The moment hung between them, fragile as spun glass. Jim nodded, his expression warm with understanding. "How long were you married?" 39 years, Margaret answered. "He died last October. Heart failure." "That's a lifetime together," Jim said softly. "He must have been a remarkable man." "He was," Margaret's voice caught. "Kind. Brilliant with numbers. Terrible dancer. He could never remember to put the cap back on the toothpaste." Jim's eyes crinkled. "Sounds like a proper human being. The best kind?" Something in his response, the simple acknowledgement of Robert as a complete person, flaws and all, loosened a knot in Margaret's chest. "What about you?" she asked. "Have you been married?" Jim nodded, taking a sip of his water. "Once, for 26 years. Catherine died 9 years ago. Cancer." "I'm sorry." The words felt inadequate. "Thank you." His smile turned reflective. "We had a good life together. 2 sons, both on the West Coast now. 3 grandchildren. You're a grandfather?" Margaret smiled, trying to picture it. "Don't look so surprised," he laughed. "My grandson Ryan is already 10. Makes me feel ancient sometimes." As their dinner progressed, Margaret found herself relaxing. Jim was easy to talk to, a good listener with a gentle sense of humor. He didn't shy away from mentioning Catherine, just as he seemed comfortable when Margaret spoke of Robert. Their past lives weren't taboo subjects to be avoided, but rather essential parts of who they were. By the time they shared a slice of apple pie for dessert, Margaret realized she was enjoying herself, truly enjoying herself, for the first time in longer than she could remember. "Can I walk you home?" Jim asked as they stepped out into the crisp evening air. Margaret hesitated only briefly before nodding. They strolled side by side through streets lined with trees ablaze in autumn colors. Their hands brushed once, twice, before Jim gently took hers in his. His palm was warm and solid against hers. different from Robert's hand, broader, with calluses in different places, but comforting in its own way. When they reached her front porch, Margaret was surprised by a pang of disappointment that the evening was ending. "I'd invite you in," she said, "but Eve has probably redecorated the house with shredded tissues by now." Jim chuckled. "Kittens are nature's perfect demolition experts." He still held her hand, his thumb tracing small circles against her skin. "Margaret, I've had a wonderful time tonight." "So have I," she admitted. "I'd very much like to see you again," he said. "Perhaps you could bring Eve in for another checkup on Monday, and we could have lunch afterward." Margaret found herself smiling. "Are you suggesting I use my kitten as an excuse to see you?" "Absolutely," he confirmed without a hint of shame. "I'm not above exploiting innocent animals for my own agenda." She laughed, the sound surprising her with its freedom. "Monday, then." Jim's eyes dropped to her lips briefly, a question in them. Margaret's heart stuttered. She wasn't ready for that, not yet. Sensing her hesitation, Jim lifted her hand instead and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "Good night, Margaret Winters," he said softly. "Thank you for taking a chance on dinner with me." As she watched him walk away, Margaret touched the spot on her hand where his lips had been. Warmth radiated from that simple point of contact, spreading up her arm and into her chest. Inside, Eve greeted her with enthusiastic purring, weaving between her ankles as if Margaret had been gone for years instead of hours. The house felt different somehow, not quite as empty, not quite as haunted by absence. "I went on a date," Margaret told the kitten, the words sounding surreal to her own ears. Eve blinked up at her, tail twitching with apparent approval. That night, lying in bed with Eve curled against her side, Margaret found herself planning what to wear on Monday. The thought should have filled her with guilt, this looking forward, this spark of anticipation, but instead, she felt a curious lightness. Robert's memory hadn't diminished. He still occupied the vast landscape of her heart. But perhaps, she thought as sleep began to claim her, there was room for new growth alongside the well-tended garden of what had been. The weekend passed in a blur of ordinary tasks transformed by Margaret's changing perspective. The house she had moved through like a ghost for a year suddenly revealed itself anew. The wallpaper in the hallway needed refreshing. The curtains in the living room, which had been closed for months, were open to admit autumn sunshine. She even found herself humming as she prepared Eve's morning meal, an old Beatles song that had once been a favorite. On Sunday, Margaret did something she'd been avoiding for months. She entered Robert's study, a room she'd kept closed since his passing. Dust motes danced in the sunlight as she pushed open the door. Everything remained exactly as he'd left it. His reading glasses perched atop a stack of financial journals, his favorite fountain pen beside the blotter, his cardigan draped over the back of the leather chair. Margaret moved slowly through the space, touching items gently, allowing memories to surface without the crushing weight of grief that had accompanied them before. She sat in his chair, running her hands along the worn armrests where his had rested for countless hours. "I met someone," she said aloud as if Robert might hear her. "His name is Jim. He's kind and thoughtful. I think you would approve." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "I'm not replacing you. I could never replace you. But I don't think I can live in this shrine anymore, Robert. It's killing me by inches." Eve appeared in the doorway, regarding Margaret with curious blue eyes before trotting into the forbidden territory. Without hesitation, the kitten leaped onto the desk, sniffing, investigating the new environment. "See what you've done?" Margaret said with a watery laugh. "You've corrupted the cat." For the first time, sitting in Robert's study didn't feel like drowning. The memories remained, precious and intact, but they no longer threatened to pull her under. Margaret took a deep breath and began to straighten the desk, not to erase Robert's presence, but to make peace with it. Monday arrived with unexpected nervousness. Margaret found herself checking the clock repeatedly as she prepared for Eve's appointment. The kitten, now significantly plumper and more energetic, protested being placed in her carrier with indignant meows. "It's for your own good," Margaret told her firmly. "Besides, don't you want to see Dr. Jim again?" At the clinic, Jim greeted them with professional courtesy in the waiting room, but his eyes conveyed a warmer message meant only for Margaret. During Eve's examination, his fingers occasionally brushed against hers, each contact sending a current of awareness through her. "She's making remarkable progress," he pronounced, giving Eve a final scratch under the chin. "You've done an exceptional job with her, Margaret." "She makes it easy," Margaret replied, watching as Eve playfully batted at Jim's stethoscope. "She's brought so much life back into the house." Jim's expression softened. Animals have a way of healing us when we thought we were the ones doing the healing. He glanced at his watch. I have one more patient to see, and then I'm free for lunch. Would you mind waiting about 20 minutes? We'll be here, Margaret assured him. Lunch extended into a long walk through Riverside Park, where autumn had transformed the landscape into a canvas of gold and crimson. They talked easily about everything and nothing: favorite books, travel destinations, the challenges of adult children living far away. Jim spoke of his veterinary practice with passion, sharing stories of memorable patients and their equally memorable owners. What did you do? Before, Jim gestured vaguely, clearly trying to ask about her life before widowhood without being insensitive. I was a librarian, Margaret replied, at the university for 30 years. I retired 3 years ago to care for Robert when he became ill. Do you miss it? The question caught her off guard. No one had asked her that before. Parts of it, she admitted. The quiet order of the reference section, helping students find exactly what they needed. The smell of books, but not the bureaucracy or the budget meetings? Jim guessed with a grin. Definitely not those, she laughed. As weeks passed, these meetings became a regular occurrence. Lunch twice a week turned into dinner on Fridays, then Sunday brunches, each encounter building a bridge between their separate lives. Jim introduced Margaret to his favorite jazz club, where they sat in companionable silence listening to a saxophone player whose music seemed to speak directly to the heart. Margaret shared her love of botanical gardens, spending a crisp November afternoon showing Jim the secret corners of the conservatory where rare orchids bloomed in defiance of the approaching winter. Through it all, Eve thrived, her playful spirit a constant reminder of how unexpected joy could enter a life that seemed closed to possibility. The kitten grew into a sleek young cat, her formerly matted coat now glossy and full, her once torn ear healed into a distinctive notch that gave her an endearingly rakish appearance. Margaret's daughter Claire called one Sunday evening, as was their custom. "How's Eve?" she asked, their conversation now routinely starting with the kitten. "Incorrigible," Margaret replied fondly. "She knocked over an entire bookshelf yesterday chasing a dust mote." Claire laughed. "And how's the vet?" The question held a hint of teasing. Margaret felt warmth rise to her cheeks. "Jim is fine." "Mom?" Claire's voice turned serious. "You sound different." "Happier." "Do I?" "Yes," Claire confirmed. "It's nice. I worried about you for so long after Dad died. I kept thinking I should move back, that you needed me there." "Oh, sweetheart." Margaret sighed. "I did need you. Your calls kept me going through the worst days. But you have your own life in London, your career." "I know, but still—" Claire paused. "I'm glad you have Jim. And Eve. I'm glad you're not alone." The simple acknowledgement brought tears to Margaret's eyes. "Thank you for saying that. Dad would be glad too," Claire added softly. "He made me promise, you know. Before he died, he made me promise to make sure you didn't shut yourself away." This was news to Margaret. "He did? He said you were too special to be alone, that your heart had too much love in it to keep to yourself." Claire's voice thickened with emotion. "So I think he'd approve of the hot vet." Margaret couldn't help but laugh through her tears. "He's not that hot." "If you say so, Mom." The conversation left Margaret reflective. As December approached, bringing with it the first anniversary of her first Christmas without Robert, she found herself dreading the holiday less than she had expected. Jim had invited her to Christmas dinner with his son's family, who would be visiting from Seattle. The thought of meeting his children filled her with nervous anticipation rather than dread. One snowy evening in mid-December, Jim and Margaret sat in her living room after dinner, a fire crackling in the fireplace that had remained cold through the previous winter. Eve was curled contentedly in Jim's lap, having adopted him as a second favorite human. Outside, snow fell in fat, lazy flakes, coating the world in pristine white. "I have something for you," Jim said, reaching into his pocket. "An early Christmas gift." Margaret looked up from her knitting, surprised. "Christmas is still 2 weeks away." "This seemed like the right moment," he said simply, handing her a small, neatly wrapped package. Margaret set aside her knitting and took the gift, her fingers trembling slightly as she unwrapped it. Inside was a velvet jewelry box. Her heart quickened as she opened it to reveal a silver pendant on a delicate chain. The pendant was shaped like a small cat with a notched ear, its body curled protectively around a heart. "Oh, Jim," she breathed, touching the pendant gently. "Turn it over," he urged softly. On the back was a single engraved word, "Beginnings." Margaret looked up, finding Jim's eyes warm with emotion. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "Margaret," he said, taking her hand, "these past months with you have been unexpected gifts in my life. I never thought I'd feel this way again, this lightness, this joy in simple moments. I know we both carry our pasts with us. Catherine will always be a part of me, just as Robert will always be a part of you." Margaret's throat tightened with emotion. "Yes," she agreed softly, "but I've discovered that the heart has an infinite capacity for love." Jim continued, "Loving you doesn't diminish what I had with Catherine. It honors it in a way. It means I learned how to love well from her, well enough to recognize what a treasure you are." Tears spilled down Margaret's cheeks. "I've been so afraid," she admitted. "Afraid that moving forward meant leaving Robert behind. Afraid that I was betraying what we had." Jim squeezed her hand gently. "You carry him with you in everything you do, in who you are. That will never change." "You make it sound so simple," she said. "Not simple," he corrected. "Natural, like the changing of seasons. Winter yields to spring, not because winter wasn't beautiful or important, but because that's the way of life." Margaret looked down at the pendant, its silver surface catching the firelight. "Beginnings," she repeated. "If you'll have me," Jim said, his voice holding a question. Margaret raised her eyes to his, seeing in them the same mixture of hope and vulnerability she felt in her own heart. This wasn't the passionate, headlong rush of young love. It was something different, something measured and wise, tempered by loss but brave enough to risk joy again. "I will," she said simply. Jim leaned forward, his hand gently cupping her cheek. This time, when his eyes asked the question, Margaret answered by closing the distance between them. His lips met hers in a kiss that felt like coming home to a place she'd never been before, familiar and new all at once. Eve, displaced by their movement, chirped in protest before settling on the couch between them, a living embodiment of the bridge that had brought them together. When they parted, Margaret rested her forehead against Jim's, a sense of peace settling over her that she had thought lost forever. "Help me put it on?" she asked, handing him the necklace. Jim carefully fastened the chain around her neck, his fingers warm against her skin. The pendant rested just above her heart, a perfect weight, a tangible reminder of unexpected second chances. Outside, snow continued to fall, covering the world in possibility. Inside, beside a crackling fire, two people who had thought their hearts closed forever held each other close, while a once-abandoned kitten purred contentedly between them, a small, living testament to how a simple act of rescue had led to the most unlikely and precious of gifts, the courage to love again. Margaret's hand found the pendant at her throat, her fingers tracing the shape of the silver cat with its protective heart. A year ago, she would never have imagined this moment, this feeling, this man. A year ago, she had been marking time, counting days of absence. Now, somehow, she found herself counting toward something instead, all because a lonely widow had rescued a kitten, not knowing it would lead her to true love.